Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to be moderating the economy session this morning, titled Securing Drivers of Growth Amid Global Fragmentation. I'm also delighted to have two eminently qualified panelists to speak to this topic. But before I introduce them, please allow me to say a few words to set the stage for the discussion to follow. As we've already heard today, protectionism and anti-globalization sentiment has been on the rise for several years now, and it's gathering pace. Industrial policy is back in fashion, not only in the Western industrialized countries that can probably afford such largesse, but it has reached the developing parts of Southeast Asia as well that can ill afford to do so. The US-China conflict has escalated during President Biden's term. In fact, it is becoming increasingly clear now that Biden has been the greater protectionist compared to Trump 1.0. The pressing question, one that has already been asked several times today, is of course, how will it be under Trump 2.0? The emerging consensus is that it is almost certainly going to be worse. Nevertheless, it seems that someone forgot to tell the statisticians about all this gloom and doom. Economic growth in Southeast Asia has remained remarkably robust. For instance, the ADB expects the region to have grown by 4.5% in 2024 and to increase to 4.7% in 2025. The major economies of ASEAN have finally returned to their 2019 pre-pandemic growth rates in 2024. The reconfiguration of supply chains has actually benefited some Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia through large inflows of FDIs, and this might partly explain the resilience so far. But how much longer is this likely to continue? If Trump carries out even some of his tariff threats, especially on China, will we finally see the kind of decoupling that starts to harm Southeast Asian countries? A recent IMF report estimates that Southeast Asia could suffer a permanent loss of income of up to 11%. Now, to place this number in context, Indonesia suffered a 13% temporary loss during the height of the Asian financial crisis. How much worse could it be for everyone if it leads to a 1930s-style global trade war? Apart from the direct impact on economic growth, this escalating conflict is already indirectly affecting the region's green transition and technological progress. What can or should Southeast Asian countries do to prepare for and mitigate against the fallout? These are some of the issues and questions that our two panelists will try and address today, I hope. We will begin with Pak Gita Wirjawan, who has a number of posts. He is chairman of Ancora Group, a partner at ISEAS Capital, a visiting scholar at Stanford, and of course, a former Indonesian trade minister. Then we will have Dr. Rebecca Santamaria, who has recently finished a very successful term as executive director of the APEC Secretariat. She was also formerly the Secretary General of the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Malaysia and has chaired the preparation of 2 AEC blueprints. This is all in the past, but she tells me that she will now plan to spend her time more productively doing yoga and meditation in Kerala in South India. Okay, so we have to finish exactly at 12:25, as President Tharman is due to arrive then, and he always is punctual, I'm told. So without further ado, let me turn to invite Gita to start things off. Gita, about 10 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Jayant. First of all, I want to express my deepest gratitude for inviting me to the Regional Outlook Forum 2025. I'm going to lay out a few observations in terms of how those observations are likely to impact the region of Southeast Asia. The first one is mainly economic. We're seeing rising inequality of wealth, not uniquely within a developing country, but also quite ubiquitously within developed economies, and also less than developed economies. We're seeing a rising inequality of income, rising inequality of opportunities, but also, quite interestingly, rising centripetalism of economic development, where we're seeing a disproportionately much more accelerated GDP per capita growth within the primary cities versus that of secondary cities, much less regional cities. These economic phenomena, I think, explain to a meaningful extent in terms of how we're seeing a rising protectionism, rising nationalistic fervor all across the world, within the developed economies, developing economies, and less developed economies. And it sort of explains some of the dreams I've had lately, where each time in my dream I've had this vision of the likes of Maloney, Modi, and Trump high-fiving each other at the future G20 meeting, which explains how the political calculus seems to be moving to the right. And I think it's a manifestation of how jobs are not being created for those in the middle class, and how inequalities are not being addressed. The second observation I want to lay out to you is really with respect to this inevitability of revisionism, which has been aptly alluded to by some of you. And this is on the back of how many economies around the world that used to be earning a lot less than $1,000 are now earning a lot more than $1,000 on a per capita per year basis. So it's difficult for some or many in developed economies to think of how this revisionism is occurring in places like the members of the BRICS, in addition to those, the Nigerias of the world, the Mexicos of the world, the Turkeys of the world, the Indonesias of the world, which used to earn a lot less on a per capita per year basis, but now are not demanding, but pushing forth a revision with respect to the pre-existing order. And this, I think, is a manifestation of regions like Southeast Asia would want to climb the global order, to expand upon its pre-existing strategic autonomy, and it inevitably gets manifested in the visuals of less rules, more volatility, and more players. This is characteristic of a more multipolar kind of world, which dovetails into less ability to multilateralize, which is why we're being pushed into this corner of having to bilateralize, at best plurilateralize. The third observation is what we would have heard from Trump himself. I think there's three essential elements within the thinking of Trump or the people around Trump. The first is, of course, the obvious inclination to impose significant tariff upon the world. And the ones more exposed than others are those that would have enjoyed trade surpluses with respect to the US. I think in Southeast Asia, the country in mind is Vietnam, which had more than $100 billion worth of trade surplus each year for the last few years. Indonesia is a bit exposed, but not as much as Vietnam is. The second essential element of a Trumpian kind of administration is the perceived intervention or interventionism with respect to the Fed. This, I think, is a discount to how economics gets perceived. The third essential element, at least in my view, is the potential deportation of between 1 to 8 million undocumented workers. What it means in the short term is, of course, the strengthening of the dollar, because the United States is going to be buying fewer goods and services, as a result of which they're not going to be using the dollar to buy foreign currencies as much. I think a potential reaction from China would be an increase of the interest rate and probably a stoppage of interest rate declination in other countries, including those in Southeast Asia. Whether this policy posturing is likely to stay on beyond the short term, nobody knows. But within intuition, I would predict that there's likely to be a recalibration. A recalibration that's going to be predicated upon the transactionality of Donald Trump, and it's safe to assume that people in Southeast Asia, including the leaders in Southeast Asia, they're kind of used to aristocratic kind of thinking, autocratic thinking, dictatorial thinking. They kind of like personalities like Trump. And the transactionality, I think, is going to dovetail into something where manageability is going to rise beyond the short term. The next observation is really with respect to how Southeast Asia economically has fared with respect to China. If we take a look at the last 30 years, the GDP per capita of Southeast Asia has grown only about 2.7 times versus China's 10 times. And this is predicated on 4 main attributes. The first one is really the massive underinvestment in education by Southeast Asia, with the absolute exception of Singapore. Second is the massive underinvestment in infrastructure. It's manifested in how China has been outspending Southeast Asia in terms of infrastructure spending at a rate of more than 4% of its GDP, whereas most Southeast Asian countries are spending a lot less than 1% of its GDP on infrastructure the last 30 years. The third is really governance. This is where the lack of optimum in the intersection between power and talent. And I think it's a discount to nation building anywhere, particularly Southeast Asia. The fourth is really competitiveness, or the lack of competitiveness. And this is empirically manifested in how Southeast Asia has only been able to issue 1 business license on a per 1,000 adult people basis, versus China's ability to issue 10 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis. If you peel the onion a little bit more, within Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Indonesia have only been issuing 0.3 business licenses on a per 1,000 adult people basis, whereas Singapore between 9 to 10. But on average, Southeast Asia is about 1 business license on a per 1,000 adult people basis. The next observation is, what is the logical, the natural intersection between Southeast Asia and the 2 superpowers of China and the US? I think there is a long list of things, but if I were to simplify it, it really boils down to AI and energy transition. Now, if you listen to the rhetoric of the Jensen Huangs of the world, whenever he's talking about coming up with the new GPU, the new GPU is going to be about 10xing to 30xing the previous GPU. What he doesn't tell you is that it's going to require 10x more energy, 30x more energy. So energy transition and AI are actually two sides of the same coin. Now I want to peel it a little bit more. In the context of energy, Southeast Asia has about 400,000 megawatts worth of power generation capabilities. The electrification on a per capita basis, Singapore and Brunei are at about 9 to 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Malaysia is at about 5,000. The rest, much less than 5,000. Indonesia is at about 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. And most of the energy creation in Southeast Asia is on a non-renewable basis. Now, what would it take for the region to modernize? I define modernity at about 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. So if you do the numbers in terms of how much more energy creation we need to build, as for Southeast Asia to be electrified at least at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, Southeast Asia needs to build an additional terawatt worth of power generation capabilities beyond the pre-existing 400,000 megawatts. That's going to cost at least $2 to $3 trillion. You add more to that if you were to replace the pre-existing that's non-renewable. Now, this is on the back of limited structural spaces. I call that monetary space. I call that fiscal space. You take a look at the fiscal spaces of Southeast Asian economies, the tax ratios of Southeast Asian economies range from 9.5 to only 16%. The typical OECD country's tax ratio is 33%. So it's got fiscal limitation. You take a look at the monetary space of all Southeast Asian economies, Malaysia and Singapore's money supply to GDP ratios are above 200%. Indonesia's money supply to GDP ratio is at about 45%. So the only way to create capital formation or economic capital formation is not from domestic sources. It's from overseas. We call that FDI. Now, when we talk about FDI, the foreign direct investment into Southeast Asia on a yearly basis, it's about $200 billion, of which Singapore has been getting consistently about $100 to $140 billion. Indonesia, about $25 to $31 billion. Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam each has been getting about $10 to $20 billion. So I think we got to pause and start thinking, how are we going to be able to get those $2 to $3 trillion so that the region becomes modern, so that we get electrified at least at 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, so that we can AI ourselves to the level needed, so that we can transition ourselves energetically to the place we want to be at. It's an impossibility, mathematically, economically. Now, the last observation, I think the vector for Southeast Asia is quite obvious. The most fundamental is really to up the ante from an educational attainment standpoint. How do you get a much more optimal intersection between power and talent? Indonesia scores 69 out of 81 countries on PISA. Singapore has just toppled China as #1 on PISA. PISA is a manifestation of the lingual and STEM proficiencies of the 15-year-olds. Vietnam now is already on the top 20. Tertiarily, most of the universities in Southeast Asia are not even ranked in the top 200 of the world. So that's the educational part. The second, how do you create more robust monetary and fiscal spaces? The third, which is my last point, it's really about creating better storytelling capabilities. How do you tell the story of a region that has 700 million people, that has $4 trillion economy? How is it that people in California don't know about Southeast Asia? How is it that people in the UK would rather know more about Taiwan or South Korea as opposed to Southeast Asia? I think these 3 points are important elements of where we want Southeast Asia vector is to be. Educational attainment, better monetary space and fiscal space creation, and better storytelling capabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gita, for those very wide-ranging comments covering a whole host of areas. I was intrigued by one of your earlier remarks, though, referring to how Trump's second term might target countries with growing surpluses, Vietnam, perhaps Thailand, maybe even Indonesia. And I guess I want to try and bring it back to this in the Q&A discussion that follows. I guess part of this is also a reflection of the reconfiguration of supply chains that we have seen already happening. So the shifts out of China to try and avoid the tariffs in the US. And so some of China's surplus is now being reported in the trade accounts of these countries. Now, the question, of course, is will this change going forward? Because the focus is now no longer on location, but on ownership. So if Trump continues this trend of focusing on ownership, the whole incentive for this reconfiguration dies out very quickly because you don't get the ability to bypass those tariffs. And so how will we then go about, do we then just absorb the tariffs? What happens then to competitiveness and so on? So maybe we can come back to that a bit later. Yeah. But now let me turn to Dr. Rebecca for her comments.
Thank you, Jayant. And thank you to the organizers for this kind invitation to be here. I heard what you said, Gita. All the points that you raised really point to what I would call headwinds. The headwinds that we all face are well beyond our control. But what we have in our control, and this is where we can deal with it from the national perspective, from the regional perspective, from the multilateral perspective, is to have collective tailwinds. And I think that's what we need more of. Now, I'm going to try and respond to the concerns raised, the morning session as well as this session, from both an insider-outsider perspective. I spent most of my career in Malaysian civil service, and there I managed industrial, trade, and investment policies. And now I've just completed my term at the APEC Secretariat, so I have this interesting perspective on how economies or countries look at the current situation. What is clear to me is that we need to get back to basics. At the national level, we need to get back to basics. Looking at, as Gita mentioned, education, monetary policy, all those things, we got to get back to the issue of competitiveness. At the national level, that's something that we can well deal with. If we look at the competitiveness reports, whether it's from the International Management Development reports or the WEF reports, we do not rank high enough. ASEAN as a collective, individual economies, individual member states, we're not doing enough in terms of competitiveness. And what that really means is looking back. If you're looking at supply chains, if you're looking at global value chains, if you're looking at FDI flows, it all goes back to the question of how competitive are you? And then it brings back the issues of looking at structural reform, looking at regulatory reform, looking at governance. So these are issues that really within the control of each economy, and these are things that we really need to get back to basics and deal with this. We need to look at how we engage with our constituents, because policymakers, your policies at the end of the day, impacts your constituents, your business community. So policymakers making policy in vacuum without enough stakeholder engagement is the other issue that we must deal with, and that's within our control. So engaging with your constituents, those who are affected by the changing global environment. We must develop capacity to stay competitive and adopt and adapt technology. You know, the whole concern over AI, it comes back again to education, to building skills, so that you do not have displacement. Policies, whether it is industrial policy, which folks seems, you know, there's a lot more talk about industrial policy, has to have, alongside it, social policy. And this is something that I've been very passionate about. You can have FDI coming in, and you have big investments coming in, and you do environmental impact assessments, but it is very rare for economies, for countries to do social impact assessments of these investments that come in, the FDI. So for me, that's well within the control of economies, of governments, of state governments. So that's one area where we need to get things right, to ensure that whatever investments, whatever policies we put in place, look at inclusivity, look at environmental concerns, look at displacement, deal with these challenges at the national level, and then take these concerns to the regional level, to the multilateral level. Within APEC, let me just say, within APEC, there's lots of work being done and conversations on just energy transition. Just a couple of months ago, we had very detailed discussions on what we can do, the frameworks that we need to build within ourselves for just energy transition. Again, it's really looking at inequalities and how do we manage those inequalities when we have such transitions taking place. A very interesting conversation for me last year, was about the informal sector. In a number of our economies, there are lots of folks in the informal sector. And the question is, why are these folks still in the informal sector? Why is it that we cannot get them to move to the formal sector? And it goes back again to the question of how competitive, how effective, how efficient is your formal sector. If you take a whole lot of processes, approvals to get you, into the formal sector itself, why should you bother? If your formal sector is so inefficient, what is the encouragement for folks to move from the informal to the formal sector? So those are some of those basic questions which are important, whether we're talking at the national level or the regional level. So getting back to basics, working together to ensure that there is coherence between your national needs, national development needs, as well as the regional needs. On the regional area, I'd like to focus on ASEAN. ASEAN has agency. ASEAN has convening power. But I really think that we haven't used that power effectively and efficiently. We can harness the power of the region. ASEAN has shown that it can do this. Look at the implementation of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. ASEAN was able to bring the parties to the table, parties that did not have FTAs among themselves, China, Japan, and Korea, and yet ASEAN managed to bring these parties together to form arguably one of the largest FTAs. But are we leveraging on that in terms of building resilience for your global supply chain? So you already have a framework. It's whether ASEAN wants to take this further and ensuring the full implementation of RCEP itself. We have shown our ability, but we can do more. The ASEAN voice on the global stage. We are members. We have members in APEC. We have members at the G20. We have members at the WTO. But is there a coherent ASEAN voice in these regional fora, international fora? So Gita says that folks in California don't know about ASEAN. It's our fault. we have the platform, but are we using it? I'll get onto one of my areas of concern. Do we need to be in BRICS to have our voices heard, to have our voice heard? We have ASEAN, we have the East Asia Forum, the East Asia Summit rather. That's where we can have our voice really amplified and shown, what is it that we stand for? What is it that ASEAN wants to achieve? I have concerns that we are not speaking loud enough, that our voice, our ability to convene is not leveraged enough. If you look at the WTO, for example, it's so easy to say that the World Trade Organization is losing its effectiveness. But who comprises the WTO? All of us in this room are members of the WTO. ASEAN has full representation at the WTO, but is ASEAN speaking as one voice, a coherent voice at the World Trade Organization to ensure that we are part and parcel of the rule-making process, that we are steering the conversation? While I believe very strongly in ASEAN, I do believe that we have not leveraged that platform, that ability to have a very coherent voice at the WTO, at the G20, at APEC. There is so much more that ASEAN can do. So that collective ability to harness the power of middle powers, that's within our control, and I do wish that we will see more of this, and that we will, as ASEAN, manage that global narrative that is important for us, the narrative on governance, the narrative on what we are capable of achieving together. We have achieved on the economic front for sure, but have we really had that story of our success out there, told, and is the other pain point for me is ASEAN, the whole story of ASEAN, integral to the education syllabus, the curriculum? Is there conversations in schools, in universities, on what ASEAN is doing, what ASEAN can do, the history behind ASEAN, the story behind ASEAN, the success of ASEAN? So those are concerns that I have, even as we're talking of all the headwinds that we are facing. We as ASEAN have that power to create the tailwinds using frameworks that are already in place, whether it's RCEP, whether it's the ASEAN Free Trade Agreements, whether the ASEAN +1 Free Trade Agreements, and hopefully with the new Digital Economy Framework Agreement that's being negotiated, we will see ASEAN again on the global stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think you followed in the footsteps of Gita in covering a broad range of issues, and I'm going to do the same thing and try and pin you down a bit more. Now as we move into the Q&A, I'm going to take my prerogative as chair to start things off by asking you to give us your thoughts. You've mentioned RCEP, ASEAN, and the FTAs in the region. Can these really help us face these new headwinds that you mentioned? In particular, the backbone of manufacturing in this region is supply chains that are centered still in China. Now, if Trump does carry through with his threat of a 60% tariff on China, this is a huge tariff. Will we see bifurcation or the kind of decoupling that results in duplicate supply chains? And what do you see what can the region do to safeguard or at least mitigate the fallout? And I ask you first, and I might invite Gita also to respond to that.
Yeah. A lot of the discussion that's taking place now, when it comes to Trump's threats of increasing tariffs, I'd like to think that those are distractions. Really, for ASEAN, those are distractions. Let's get on with what we have. We have the mechanisms, we have the framework, we have traditional relationships among ourselves. Let's build on that. We have RCEP, as I say, in place, and RCEP really is an agreement that provides the necessary framework for us to grow as a region and build our supply chains. Let's focus on that and not be so distracted by talks of tariffs. I'm not a fan of tariffs. I've seen, we've all learned from history what happens when you do a tit for tat on tariffs. So let's instead focus on what we have and build on what we have. If we go back in time and see, the tariff wars, there's very little that we can gain from that. So instead of spending energy and on discussions of possibilities, what can happen if the tariffs, these are still threats and distractions. Let's instead focus our energy on what we have on the table, focus our energy on getting our act together, building on what we have already, the frameworks that we already have in place. And I know there's a lot of conversations going on preparing ourselves for ASEAN 2045. Yes, what do we need to do more of and strengthen ASEAN and its dialogue partners and ASEAN-China relations? There's still a lot to be done. So for me, let's not get distracted. Let's focus, and focusing on getting the region growing. We've shown how, in spite of Trump 1.0, TPP morphed into CPTPP, and we're moving on. So I'd like to see us continue doing more of that, using ASEAN as a base.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Gita, do you have any views on this?
I can talk a little bit about reshoring or friendshoring. If it relates to the possibility of some violation with respect to rules of origin, I'm actually less concerned about that. I think one needs to understand that China has created such supremacy in terms of industrialization, right? They're the world's industrial base. For them to relocate any of that or much of that meaningfully, we're going to have to be as competitive as they are industrially, which we're not. And I've laid out the reasons why. Second, China has massive rare earth capabilities. The third is that they have massive energy transition capabilities, which even the US does not have, anything to equate. So if I were to think about how we're going to be able to reshore anything from China to Southeast Asia, it would be with limitations because of the fundamental limitations we have, educationally, storytelling, capability-wise, and then the fiscal and monetary space. But I think, to be very candid, the logical way to intersect with both China and the US or the US would be to look at China as a technological capital allocator as opposed to an economic capital allocator. And this is empirical. If you take a look at the BRI, which was announced in 2013 for Southeast Asia, it was supposed to be about $720 billion. But the realization after 11 years has been about $70 to $80 billion. That, I think, dovetails back into the dual economic circulation philosophy of Xi Jinping, which boldly wants to further domesticate economic activities in China, which really means less capital exportation capabilities. But if we want to look at the US, call it the G7, the M2, the liquidity within the G7 is a lot more than $100 trillion. And a lot of that capital needs to be reallocated at the rate that interest rates are going to come down in the US. And capital allocators from the G7 are going to want to reallocate capital to places such as Southeast Asia. But the problem is that we're not offering the necessary competence or competitiveness. We're not offering the necessary clarity on the enforceability of rules and regulations. People put money into Singapore not because of ideology, not because of geography, not because whether or not Singapore has bauxite, tin, or coal, but because of the clarity on the enforceability of rules and regulations. To the extent that the other countries in Southeast Asia could up the ante with respect to that, I think there's going to be quite a meaningful reallocation of capital from the G7, inclusive of the West. So the way to narrate our story to the world, inclusive of China and the US, is to go to China for technological capital allocation and to go to the G7 for economic capital allocation. And I think we've got our work cut out. But in the midterm and long term, to the extent that we can Singaporeanize our way a little bit better, to the extent that we can copycat what Vietnam has done in recent times, I think we might have a chance. Yeah.
Thank you, Gita. So we have time for questions. So,
10 minutes.
yeah, just over 10 minutes. Please, it's a bit difficult for me to see you, so please holler if I can't see you. Yes, please, Hokan. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Hokan from ISEAS. So I think one prospect of Trump tariffs, especially if it's a very blanket one on China, would be that China's exports could go flooding world markets. How do you see that prospect, the likelihood of that, and how should Southeast Asia respond? And to answer Rebecca, maybe to try and nudge in a more optimistic direction, what can be some rallying points? Is it the energy transition? Rallying points for ASEAN to get their act together, to be more cohesive and use that convening power. I mean, it seems that the region at least doesn't have to deal with any kind of mass denialism about the threats of climate change, and all countries seem to be on board. But is that just an example of one, or what might others be? Yeah, thanks.
Okay. We might take a few. Yes, we have one more.
Yes, hello, I'm Dr. Khan, current student at RSIS, and first of all, thank you very much for the insightful presentations. And as you touched upon during the session, inequalities, especially within country inequalities, are high, remain high, or in some cases are even rising. And this is no exception for FDI allocation, which is a prime driver of economic growth. So my question is, what can countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, do to not only leverage more FDI into their economies, but also better FDI to drive a more inclusive economic growth? Thank you.
Right. I think we might, get your responses.
Sure.
If you take any more.
Well, the first one, I think it's already happening in terms of the flooding of Chinese goods and services onto Indonesia. And we kind of like the Oppos and the Xiaomis and the BYDs. We don't mind those. But I think the way forward is to figure out a way so that we can move up the value chain. How do we convince the BYDs of the world to build manufacturing capabilities in China? They're already doing that in Thailand. So we just need to get them, we need to convince them to build some manufacturing capabilities in Indonesia so that we can move up the value chain. I think it's inevitable and it's unstoppable that in terms of the continuation of the dumping or flooding of goods and services from China, as long as Trump, maintains his seriousness with respect to the imposition of tariff. On the second, in terms of how do you get FDI to help bring down inequality, I think it's quite structural. I think one of the reasons, or two reasons as to why liberalism has not worked would have been the two distortions right? This would have been propagated by the Frank Fukuyamas of the world. The first would have been neoliberalism, which was supposed to help democratize ideas, democratize capital, democratize public goods. But in reality, there hasn't been a commensurate democratization of public goods. I've been arguing that I think democracy shouldn't just be the distribution of power to the hands of many. I think it has to be manifested in the distribution of public goods in terms of healthcare, welfare, intellect, cognitive capability, social value, and moral value. That hasn't happened, which leads to the fact that neoliberalism has been a distortion to liberalism. So how do we get to the point where we can actually distribute capital so that we can help bring about? It really boils down to that structural element of getting that better intersection between power and talent. At the rate that we're not educating the populace as much as we should. One data point that I want to share with you, in Indonesia, for instance, 88% of the households are led by people with less than university education. 93% of the electorate don't have university education. So how do you hope for, or how do you expect educational attainment to be disrupted in a good way within the households? The only way to do that is to actually disrupt it at any social institutions outside the households. Call that schools, call that the synagogues, the churches, the mosque, or the cafes that you hang out your friends with. But there's no pushing forth of ideas that are good for bringing about better educational attainment. So the only obvious way is to actually recruit really, really good teachers within the schooling systems, which I think Indonesia has taken a view on, and hopefully the other Southeast Asian economies will take a view on. Now, if we get that, I think we might have a better optimum in terms of the intersection between power and talent, and there's better hope, better prospect for redistribution of welfare and wealth and income and opportunities, so that whatever money that's coming into places like Southeast Asia is going to help bring down inequality of those things that I've already outlined.
Yep.
Thanks, Gita.
I agree. I mean, we need to spend more on education. We need to spend more on human capital development. I think if you're looking at what we have done well in ASEAN, we've managed FDI, but what kind of FDI have we managed to get in? We need to really look at FDI that would support the growth, the human capital aspect of our economies. For me, those are things that really matter. Getting back to the drawing board, looking at our education systems, I really believe that that's something we haven't invested enough in. We have too much politics in education. I'm speaking from a Malaysian perspective. Too much of politicking in the education, so we get distracted. So there's so much potential within ASEAN and individually in ASEAN, but often politics gets in the way. I think that's an area of concern for me. We need some clarity in our education system. We really need to relook our education system, given the way digitalization is moving forward, artificial intelligence. How do we make sure that our children take advantage of artificial intelligence as opposed to being enslaved by artificial intelligence? So there's a lot happening, so much more that we can do. And I do hope that we take politics out of the situation and focus on the strength, the capital strength of our people.
Thanks, Rekha. Yeah, I think we still have time for maybe a couple of quick questions, if there's any pressing questions, unless I'm told to wrap up because the president's arriving.
This one.
This one? Yep, please.
Well, I'm Leo Stradinata from ISEAS. I'd like to ask a simple question to the presenters. It's about technological development and the impacts of Southeast Asia. How much dependence Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia and Malaysia, for instance, on China's technology, whether or not that the impact on China technology is going to make the countries much more reliant on China? Thank you.
Yeah, very quick one, and then, yeah.
Hello. Yes, thank you, Jay. My question is to Dr. Rebecca. I really appreciate your idea of talking about a collective tailwind to address the headwind. And you mentioned about the importance of a regional competitiveness. And we know that, and I agree with all your points about ASEAN's agencies as well. But my question is that while we want to see ASEAN as a collective production and consumption base, as a collective entity, but member states within the groupings are competing against each other in every single sector, in every single industry. So how do you actually find ways to actually overcome it so that ASEAN can be more united in its competitive approach? Thank you.
That's a tough one.
So, Gita, do you want to start and then?
Oh, I'll take the first one. I think I've said it earlier that the dependence on China as a technological capital provider is already very high from Southeast Asia, and it's going to continue to increase. I mean, if you go to California and many other states in the US and the UK and Africa and Southeast Asia, for example, the solar panels are all made in China, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But in order for Southeast Asians to buy the solar panels, we need to get the money, the economic capital. This is where I think the United States and other members of the G7 could play a part. I mean, just, you know, BlackRock and the other 16 transnational investment firms manage around probably 70 to 80 trillion dollars worth of liquidity. Most of that is being deployed just within the US and Western European countries, very little to outside. That's, I think, largely because of their not knowing about Southeast Asia. They're not knowing about the narrative of Southeast Asia in the next 10 to 20 years. This is something that we've got to basically go out and blow the trumpet on. But we've got to back it up with rising marginal productivity. You know, most Southeast Asian marginal productivities are less than $50,000 on a per capita per year basis. Singapore has a marginal productivity of about $200,000 on a per capita per year basis. So if you work on those needles in terms of improving upon our pre-existing competitiveness and then work on our storytelling abilities, I think there's a great chance for us to be able to survive in a much more multipolar world. It's probably not going to be as difficult as it may seem.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question. I know we often see ourselves as competing as opposed to complementing each other, and there's a lot more that ASEAN can do. For my bone is that we tend to operate in three pillars. There is an overlap of the work that we can do. For example, the work that we're doing in the digital sphere, sadly, it's not in the economic pillar, but in the social cultural pillar. So I have some concerns there. I think it's high time we start looking at how we operate as ASEAN. The three pillars may or may not work very well for us today. It worked well for us in the early days when we were talking of the ASEAN Economic Community or the ASEAN Community. Today, we need to make sure that when we talk of the digital economy, it's not residing in the social cultural pillar. It's for me, that's an issue that we need to deal with. Likewise, when we're talking of the security side, security of trade, it is not an economic pillar, or it is not a political security pillar. It is cross-cutting, and I think those three pillars, it's high time ASEAN relooks how we classify ourselves in those three communities. You know, there is so much overlap. We need to look at it more horizontally as opposed to verticals. So there's a lot of work that we still need to do as ASEAN. So we keep looking at ourselves as competing as member states competing for limited resources. But I think if we start to rethink away from those pillars, but along horizontals, we have a better chance of restructuring how we think of ourselves and not so much compete, but complement each other. One key area is education. I think there's a lot more that ASEAN can do in education. Now that resides in the social cultural pillar. If we take that and pass it through the other two pillars and look at education across, I think we have a better chance of dealing with some of the challenges that we're facing today.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We did start a bit late, so we have actually taken up exactly 1 hour. And you'll also be spared my summing up, which I'm very grateful for, because this has been a very wide-ranging discussion of a lot of important big picture issues. But please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their thoughts today.